Gentlemen, I can't come to you first, Darren. I get the impression, I'm being told that Prime Minister obviously didn't want to do this. He doesn't like doing these things. He couldn't really defy the data. But he also took a political calculation that pausing now is nowhere near as politically damaging as unleashing on the 21st of June and then having to reverse later in the summer or early autumn. I don't know if you've heard that too, Darren.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I mean, first of all, it was a very tired Boris Johnson. I thought when he was answering those questions, wasn't quite himself. Probably not a surprise given the fact that he's obviously been hosting the G7 and went to Brussels for the NATO summit today. But yeah, very much the government's point of view is essentially, is it better now to delay these things for 4 weeks and make sure that it is only 4 weeks? And they would argue, you know, the 19th of July is a different date from June 21st, rather than this potentially irreversible slide where you start going backwards if you open up and things get really quite tricky when it comes to the infection rates and hospitalisations. And, you know, these decisions, Andrew, are always quite tricky for the government. Ultimately, you know, there is an awful lot of political pressure from the backbenchers in the Conservative Party who do want to see things open up much quicker, but the government's had its fingers burnt time and time again during this pandemic crisis. And if there's one thing they do know, is that they've got public opinion on the side. I mean, there was a YouGov poll out this evening that says that 71% of English people support the restrictions for the next 4 weeks. Only 24% are opposed. And so time and time again, we've got a cautious public who essentially are on side with the governments.
And Tom, I think therefore he's made the political calculations. I'm not saying it's all politics at all. He's clearly being advised by the data too. These are serious issues. But the political damage to him at the moment would seem to be slight for doing this. There are the lockdown skeptics, I'm sure many of them watching our channel here now. They'll be very angry. They saw it coming, but they'll still be angry. They want to try and get back to normality. But he'll look at the poll that Darren mentioned. He knows that no matter how much dissident MPs like Steve Baker, who we had on earlier on his own backbenches, are critical, they haven't got the votes to overturn this in the Commons, and it does need to go before the Commons again. So the political damage now is de minimis compared to the damage he would suffer if he did release and then had to lock down really toughly in the next couple of months.
Absolutely, and we've seen that there's a fairly steady double-digit lead in the polls for the Conservative Party, and there has been for some time. One of the really frustrating things for the Labour Party is that they put all of the blame for this delay on the shoulders of the Prime Minister in terms of letting in that Indian variant in the first place. The Labour Party has turned itself into, or is trying to present itself as, the party of strong borders. Now, that might come across as a little incredulous for people watching at home, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why that attack isn't landing so well, because not many people sort of perceive the Labour Party as being that party that would be naturally as strong on the borders as the Conservative Party. And we've known from various leaks from Cabinet over the last few months that the people that have actually been pushing for a stronger border policy haven't been the sort of left-leaning people in the Conservative Party. It's been the people like Priti Patel. But I think there is a certain amount of blame that we can level at Boris Johnson for wanting a more open travel system. And I was writing on GB News earlier today an article that was exploring this and exploring the political ramifications for that decision, because of course it's deeply, deeply frustrating that we're in this position today. We were doing so well against the previous variants of COVID. The data was far better than any of the SAGE models had ever predicted. Many people were arguing actually we could unlock earlier than the timetable, and yet that Indian variant seems to have completely scuppered everything. And it is true, the data is concerning. We've seen some models today from the government scientists that show if everything were to be let loose on the 21st, we could see a hospitalisation wave that matches that of the first wave back in March and April 2020. So there are some serious issues here, and it's no wonder that Boris Johnson, faced with that decision, has taken the action he has.
I was going to say, Andrew, it was really interesting listening to the scientists, because obviously they were suggesting that actually this 4-week delay would potentially knock off 30 to 50% of the hospital admissions that we might have seen if there wasn't this delay. But I don't know if you guys picked this up. There was a kind of nuance in the sense that Boris Johnson was suggesting, of course, June 21st was the earliest date for so-called Freedom Day, and that actually July 19th would be the terminus stage, that it will happen. Can't give a cast iron guarantee, but going as far as they can. But what was really interesting is almost that it seemed that Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance were pretty much on board with that. There seemed to be an acceptance amongst the scientists that actually we do need to get to a stage where we kind of move out of this and try and manage, I suppose, this virus that's not going to go away, and that the restrictions at some stage do have to come to an end. And if they don't come to an end this summer, when do they come to an end? Because things get tricky again when we come into the autumn and winter, and that's why we saw those reports in newspapers the last couple of days suggesting that restrictions could be in place until next spring. My
understanding is that this modelling that was presented to them, which shows this huge increase in hospital admissions if they were to open up, that they haven't put much credence by that. I think they're beginning to have second thoughts about some of this modelling, because it doesn't always turn out to be right. But the exact course of hospital admissions as the Delta variant gathers pace through the country was very hard to predict, and they didn't really know where it was going to go. They know it wouldn't be as bad as in a pre-vaccinated Britain, but it could still be very demanding for hospitals. And I think, Tom, in the end, they just decided, and surprising thing to me is they didn't seem to be divided either, unlike previous big decisions like this. They just decided to be prudent, Tom, I think.
Well, there's a fundamental difference here between the decision taken today and the previous decisions to go into lockdowns. And number one is that we have vaccines. One of the things that we've been hearing today is that these are entirely avoidable deaths now, because we know that PHE data out today shows incredible efficacy of double jabs of all of the vaccines that we use in the UK. It's quite remarkable that we have made such progress with that science and that ability to whack COVID on the nose. So it would seem almost odd to not take that chance to almost halve that potential peak. So that's one side of the question. And I think the other side of the question is that we aren't experiencing the same sort of lockdown that we did previously. This isn't really a lockdown at all.
No.
I went to the cinema over the weekend. I've been to several pubs this week.
What did you
see, Tom?
What did I see? Oh, I saw Cruella. Which was a marvellous film.
I saw that. I thought it was terrible.
Did you? You know what?
Maybe absolutely terrible. We're getting off the point.
I just liked that the whole thing was set in London, and it's nice to see a big Hollywood film.
It was wonderful. It was wonderful to see London like that. And you're right. It's not. As I walk out of here we are in the Paddington base, and there are people all around. It's not like that lockdown of March or April where the streets were deserted. There is a semblance of normality, and I guess that must have played, Darren, into the Prime Minister's calculation as well, that it's not such a severe lockdown, and we can survive another 4 or 5 weeks of this, though some businesses will be hit very badly. I was struck, Darren, you mentioned it, that he did seem to get buy-in. I mean, he kind of looked for it, but he did seem to get some buy-in from the two scientists there, you know, Dr. Gloom and Dr. Grimm, that actually, yeah, we should be all right by July the 19th.
Yeah, I think so. I certainly picked up on that. And you're right, when you look at where most people are in terms of the restrictions, okay, frankly, my local pub, for example, can open because it's a really small one and it just can't survive with social distancing. But for most businesses, for most hospitality businesses, they can kind of function. Of course, they'd love to get back to full capacity. But in the end, you know, the restrictions that are placed at the moment, they're not that repressive for people. As you say, life is relatively back to normal. There was some good news on weddings today. I think that will help an awful lot of people. I think there are 50,000 weddings planned over the next 4 weeks. So that will go some way to helping many couples who've already had to cancel or postpone their weddings from last summer. But there is one person, Andrew, who was really mad today, flipping mad, and that was Sir Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker of the House of Commons. He gave out to the government in the Commons today that yet again Boris Johnson was standing in Downing Street giving a press conference announcing these measures to the media, to journalists, indeed to Tom, and not to MPs first. And it's not the first time this has happened, but he was pretty angry today, red-faced, with attacking the government, saying this is entirely unacceptable. They need to come and explain it to MPs first. Boris Johnson, though, not doing that. Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, currently doing it in the Commons right now.
Well, we always know that Mr Johnson's not a great House of Commons man. It's not his natural habitat. So Mr Hancock will have yet another day in the sun. Tom, Darren, thank you very much for being with me tonight, marking our cards on this important development.